Hello, welcome to this follow-up activity video. So in this video, hopefully you've now had a go at the seminar, the additional practice activity, and I'm just going to talk back through how I would have presented the data, the output, and the sorts of things I'm looking for, and how I would interpret those. Okay, so this is the activity sheet. So we know we had data for a group of a sample. Within that, people were employed either on a permanent or casual basis. We had a measure of their stress, and we knew what their identity, gender identity was. Okay. So the first question is around what level stress is measured at, just to start thinking about those levels of measurement and becoming more and more familiar with different types of data. The second question was around using this output from SPSS for descriptive statistics and presenting that in a single APA style table. And then the final question is around interpreting that data. What does it mean? Okay, and we're thinking about what does this information tell us about our sample. Okay, so the output itself looks like this. So this is where the file was taken from. So in this document, I'm going to outline some of the answers to the questions, and with some of those, for example, how information could be presented and be compliant with APA style, there could be more than one approach. But with the first question, at what level is the stress variable measured? Well, we can see from the data, if we look back at the original, we can see that it's self-rated levels of stress on a 15-point scale, and we can see that that ranges from 1 to 15. Now, although it's not really completely explicit here, it looks like the minimum score that you could have would be 1 and the maximum would be 15. As there isn't probably a 0 then on that scale, and even if you had, you did have a 0 on the scale, it would be unlikely that that measure, a 0 would represent the total absence of stress, okay, which is what a ratio level variable would be. So in this case, I'd say that's probably the next level down. So it is still continuous, but it's interval, and that's where the distances between points are equivalent on the scale, but there's no true 0. So this is how I might go about presenting that information in an APA formatted table. So this is all presented together, but it's been split over 2 pages. But what we have here is then a table number. And every table you use should have a clear table number. It should be a clear but concise title, and that should be presented in italics. Your table number should not. And then it should be very clear what the groups are. So there should be labels for each of the columns of data and for each row, so we know exactly which measurement, how that is measured, and which group it corresponds to. So in this case, I've laid it out so that there is employment type in the first column, casual and permanent, and then I have the mean stress score with the standard deviation in brackets next to it. Now that could be presented in separate tables. In some tables, it's essentially whatever is clearest to interpret. Then I have the stress score range. Now instead of a range, I could have presented that as the minimum and maximum scores. You would tend not to present both though. And here I've got the percentage of males and females in the group. And again, there could be different ways of presenting that. I have a note underneath the table, which just says that there are 10 people per group. Again, there's some ways where you could include that inside the table itself without having a note at the bottom of the table. But that information looks fairly clearly presented, and it's labelled effectively. So that's just one way that you could lay out the data. Okay, so for the third question, what do the descriptive statistics outlined in question 2 tell us about the stress scores and gender of participants across the groups? What we're looking for are patterns. Okay, so, and if we're the researchers, we want to understand our sample well, and if this is the beginning stages of a piece of research, we want to understand how our groups are similar or different from each other, because that could have implications for how well the intervention, which is around coaching, can be run for those 2 groups, or how we might interpret any differences in our outcome variable, which is well-being in this case, how we might interpret those differences. So if you know there are pre-existing differences in the group on important variables, that could affect the confidence with which we can interpret our results from our data analysis. So here I'm looking at the casual and permanent groups, and I'm going to start by looking at the categorical data here. And we can see in the casual group there is 70% of that group are made up of males and only 30% are made up of females. So we can see here there's a gender imbalance in this group. Probably what we're looking for really is to have 50-50, so 50% of males and females. That would make it more balanced. However, what is also important is looking at the permanent employment group. Only 30% of that group are males, if you contrast that with the casual group, and 70% are females. So again, there's an imbalance, but it's in the opposite direction. So we need to consider the impact that that might have later on our research. In terms of looking at the mean stress score, we can see here that the two means are fairly similar to each other. So that might be somewhat reassuring. If we had one group that was very stressed in comparison to another, then and then we tried to run a coaching intervention for the two groups and then looked at well-being. Well, if we know going into that one group has much higher stress levels than the other, that would be concerning, because no doubt that would affect their experience of the intervention, that would affect their well-being. But here they do look fairly similar. And again, so that is just looking at it, we're just observing the differences here. We've not actually tested whether there is a significant difference between these two, but they look fairly similar to each other. However, there's something around the stress score range here. So you can see that casual, the range is only 8 points, but in permanent there are 12 points. Now I'm going to let you decide what you think that might mean, and what the implications of that might be in this context. But those are the sorts of things that we're looking for, and that's what we'll be trying to write up. Now, there's some information here about that. It's deliberately put into note form, so you could try and write that in your own words using an academic writing style, and try and put that into your own words, because that's an important skill to develop. Okay. Remember, you've got your descriptive statistics walkthrough, which will take you through a lot of this with another example, and reporting again in another example. So have a look at that, and if you have any questions, please post the discussion forum, or please ask in your seminars. Thank you.